I mean, it's hard to know where to start today. I was just thinking this morning, President Trump, when he was running for office, he said, or he used to brag about the fact that during his first term, at least, there were no new wars. We have a bunch of new wars now, and it's hard to know which one to ask you about, but we could talk about Iran first. There was a news report from today I wanted to ask you about. It was reported that Trump has given the Iranian authorities this ultimatum that they have to, one, end their nuclear program, but also they have to stop producing missiles that they say can reach Israel. That's a quote. And that they have to end support for what are called these Iranian proxy groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis. We're always told that like Iran or Russia or whichever country that the Hawks want to send us into war with at the moment, that they're always like the most intractable enemy. They just can't be negotiated with. They're just this extreme evil and irrational. But maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like the side that is just impossible to negotiate with, at least in this case, in the case of the Iran nuclear deal, is the United States and our government, who it appears keeps shifting these terms at Israel's behest and demanding that Iran just accept terms that we already know are unacceptable to that country. Is that incorrect?
No, that's the way I look at that. A close parallel from history would be the Rambouillet Accord, which Madeleine Albright, this was her ultimatum to Slobodan Milosevic to prevent the Kosovo War of 1999. And they lied about it and denied it. It was actually at the time a secret Annex B that said that the Yugoslav government essentially had to unconditionally surrender to the United States and NATO and allow US and NATO forces free reign, total access to every last square inch of Yugoslavia, right up to and including the presidential palace, or whatever, and then with full immunity from all local law and this kind of thing. So this was, in other words, a deal that was made to be rejected, right? It was instead of an offer you can't refuse, is an offer made to be refused, that he would have no choice. In fact, even Henry Kissinger said in an interview with Boris Johnson in the Telegraph, if you could believe it at the time, that this was a deal that no Serb president, the most angelic Serb president, could possibly sign, right? So it was made to be rejected. And I think this is the same kind of thing where they're essentially laying down demands that are, well, certainly in the case of the missiles, just impossible, right? I mean, demanding that they stop supporting Hezbollah and the Houthis. I mean, maybe that even is within the realm of negotiation, although I don't know. But then entirely abandoning their nuclear program, not just enrichment. I mean, this has been absolute hardline position of the Ayatollah this whole time since 2006, that once they mastered the nuclear fuel cycle, that they're never going back and they're never going to stop enrichment. It's a matter of national independence and national pride and all that. And it at least was serving as sort of a latent nuclear deterrent, that look, we know how to enrich uranium. Don't make us enrich up to weapons grade. Don't make us decide to go ahead and make a nuclear weapon. Well, Trump called their bluff last June on that and set their program back enough. I guess I'd be very surprised if they actually had an ongoing enrichment program. They could have a secret one. They could even have a secret bomb program since June, since the disruption in the inspections. That is within the realm of possibility, although I don't see any real indication of that. Um, but I'll tell you, I'd be very surprised if the Ayatollah said, okay, fine, just don't bomb me and I'm going to give up enrichment now and any prospect of ever enriching again. And I don't know, there are different factions inside that government too. I don't know if that would threaten the stability of the regime if they did that severe of an about face on such a crucial issue. And then the missiles, I mean, what good is a missile deterrent if it has to be short of the range that can hit the country that's threatening you? And it's just such an unreasonable demand on its face. If you compare this to 2003 and Colin Powell up there at the UN going, look, man, Iraq is a special case, okay? They got sarin and mustard gas and Tabin, and anthrax, and we think they're making nukes and they'll give these weapons to Al Qaeda to attack our homeland. We got to prevent it. Now, that was all lies, but at least he built a whole sandcastle for you there. Right now, and one of which was, and we think he's still got some missiles that he agreed to give up at the end of the Iraq War. Otherwise, they wouldn't, the first Iraq War. Otherwise, they wouldn't be considered illegal at all. Scud missiles, right? Um, and none of that was true, not even the conventional missiles. But here, that's all they got is conventional missiles. They're going to start an aggressive war on, it's hard to even call that a pretext. It's nothing. And of course, when, for anyone who knows the first thing about it, no one thought, we all agree, everyone knows it's a fact that other than Israeli lies at the time, which they even walked back themselves, there was no advance in the nuclear program. They were not making nuclear weapons. That's 60% enriched uranium. That was not to make nuclear weapons with. You need high 80s or even 90 something percent enriched uranium 235. That 60% enriched uranium was just a card to play in negotiations to negotiate away. It was just to negotiate from some kind of position of strength when they're in the position of weakness, was all that was. And nothing had changed. And even Tulsi Gabbard had confirmed that to the Senate as recently as like a week before the attack. And then even Netanyahu himself told Brett Baer on Fox News, essentially conceding the same truth, that they could get a bomb within 1 to 2 years, he said. In other words, if they began to try now, which they are not doing, right? So Trump, when he did attack last June, was accepting the Israelis' false framework that for Iran to have a nuclear program at all is the same thing as them having a nuclear weapons program. And therefore, that was good enough to attack. But again, just a completely thin pretext, something that any reasonable American should reject.
Yeah, what you're talking about is so true. Just this barrage of propaganda that we've all just been so used to every time there's a lead up to one of the wars that the Hawks want to send other people's children to fight for them. That's exactly what's going on now, and it's recognizable. It's actually kind of hard to follow now. You're right. During the war on terror, when we were going to war against Iraq and the lead up to it, it was a very focused campaign of propaganda talking about aluminum tubes and weapons of mass destruction. Even in June, I would say it was a lot more focused uh, than what is happening now, where it seems like every week the excuse is changing. I mean, 2 weeks ago, it was that we had to go and avenge the protesters, the supposedly tens of thousands who were killed. Just the most effective crackdown by the Iranian security state ever, apparently, on par, we're told, with the Holocaust, with the efficiency of how they were able to kill dissidents in their country. It's unbelievable, of course, but that's what we were told. And then, of course, we're told that we have to take out their ballistic missiles too. You compared all of this on X, I think, last week to an incident that happened in the 1990s, which is when this kind of barrage of propaganda from corporate media really started. I think it was in relation to the Gulf War. This person named Naira gave
Mhm.
testimony to the Senate. That was well before my time, but it was this exact model of atrocity propaganda that we just saw deployed, last week and 2 weeks ago. Can you tell us what happened there and how it really is the exact same thing that we're seeing today?
Yeah. So in the summer of 1990, the end of July, beginning of August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait and conquered the whole country in a day, day and a half, something, a big coup de main. And so then the administration announced they actually weren't going to do anything about it other than warn Iraq they better not go to Saudi Arabia until Margaret Thatcher came to town, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who had interests in Kuwait, and said that, "Oh, you're not going to go wobbly now on me, Bush, are you?" And her people gave Bush Senior a backbone transplant. They said, and then he announced, "Oh, this will not stand." And so then America started building up what they called Operation Desert Shield in transferring military equipment to Saudi Arabia to prepare to drive Iraq back out again. Now, the thing is about it is Americans had never heard of Kuwait before and they did not care. And this whole sanctity of international law that says one nation can't invade another, I mean, we'd just been backing Iraq in their invasion of Iran for 8 years before that. And you know what I mean? Just rang hollow. So he needed to drum up emotional reasons for the war, basically. And one of them was they claimed that the Iraqis were building up their forces on the Saudi border. They were preparing to roll on Riyadh. Then from there, they would monopolize all Middle Eastern oil. Next thing Saddam Hussein outranks Hitler as world's greatest dictator and marches on Paris, and we're all enslaved. And so we got to stop him now at Kuwait, you see. Um, was not taken off as well. And then, but they really hit pay dirt with the testimony of the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. And she went before the U.S. House of Representatives and testified that she saw, as a nurse in a Kuwaiti hospital, she saw Iraqi soldiers take the incubators, dump the babies on the cold floor to die, and then steal the incubators, whether to just destroy them out of malice or for the babies back in Baghdad who needed them so desperately, or what they never explained, I don't think. But they left the babies on the cold floor to die, she said. And all this was a total hoax, never happened. She was not even in the country at the time. She was not a nurse. And yet, Amnesty International said it was all true. And so that was all everybody needed in order to run with it. And H.W. Bush brought this up over and over again. He said, this is proof that this wasn't just an invasion, that these atrocities prove that Saddam Hussein's intent is to completely dismantle and destroy the country of Kuwait and its people. And so that's why this is such a travesty and why we absolutely have to intervene now. And it was a big part of the war propaganda that got people, and including in the Congress, to change their vote or change their mind and decide to vote to authorize the thing. Boy, once I heard that sad story about the poor babies, as Bill Hicks said, oh, look, a fetus. Look, everybody, a fetus. Whatever you need. Come on. You, the apathetic, docile masses. Look, a fetus. Come on, we're going to war. And it worked. And people got behind it. And this is what started America's 35-year war against Iraq. We've been bombing them ever since, based on that. And then, quite importantly, the Bush administration decided to stay in Iraq, but then he lost the election to Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton, horrible person every single way. I'm not making a value judgment here, but I'm just saying he did at least float the possibility, and he shouldn't have said this out loud, but he did say it out loud, that maybe we could normalize relations with Iraq now. Well, that kicked the Kuwaitis and the Israelis into gear. And the Israelis' complaint was that America beat up on Iraq so badly in Iraq War I that Iraq was not powerful enough to balance against Iran anymore. So they wanted America to stay in Saudi Arabia in order to balance against them both. And the Kuwaitis, of course, the last thing that they wanted was normalization between the United States and Iraq. That could be at their expense in numerous ways. Not that we let them invade again, but you know what I mean. They would not want that. And so, what happened was the same guy who sent his daughter up there to lie about the babies being thrown out of the incubators, he's the same guy who made up the hoax that Saddam Hussein tried to assassinate George H.W. Bush with a truck bomb in Kuwait in, I think it was March or April of 1993. And Bill Clinton had resisted Israeli insistence on this dual containment policy and staying in Saudi in order to bomb and blockade Iraq and still enforce the sanctions and wage this sort of Cold War imbalance against Iran at the same time until this hoax. And the same guy who made up the incubator hoax was the same guy who made up the assassination against H.W. Bush hoax. And the Boston Globe and Seymour Hersh in the New Yorker showed that article is called "A Case Not Closed." I forgot the title of the Boston Globe article, but you can read them about it too. And all it was a whiskey smuggling ring. And they just blew it up and pretended that it was a bomb plot and it was all a bunch of crap. And the CIA debunked it, but there were a couple at the FBI who wanted to pretend that this one explosive definitely proved that it linked this guy to that thing and whatever. And it was all a bunch of crap. But they used that to convince Bill Clinton to, first of all, strike Baghdad. Again, as Bill Hicks pointed out, he shot 22 cruise missiles that cost $6 million apiece and killed 22 or whatever it was, 24 innocent people, including the famous Iraqi artist. I believe her name was Layla Al Aryan. Unless I'm thinking of somebody else. I'm pretty sure that was her name,
I
and
think
she had
Layla
done.
Alarian is Sammy Alarian's.
No, yeah, that is I'm sorry, I always confuse her name. You're right, and she wrote a great book. She edited a great book called Collateral Damage about Iraq War II, by the way. I'm
Okay.
sorry I got that name wrong. Well, it was this Alatia or something like that was the name of the artist. She had done a mosaic of H.W. Bush's face that you walked all over his face when you walked into this famous hotel in
Mm.
Baghdad. And so then, oh, they just it happened to accidentally kill her with a Tomahawk cruise missile. Anyway, and then that was the basis of the Bill Hicks joke about when you get elected, they show you footage of the Kennedy assassination from an angle you've never seen before. And then you go, well, what's my policy? First, we bomb Baghdad. You got it. And so there you go. That was his, inauguration into the presidency there. And the ensconcing of the permanent dual containment policy that lasted through the rest of his presidency, through the rest of the century, and was the primary motivation for turning America, Saudi, and Britain's pet terrorists, the Al Qaeda, Islamic Jihad, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and the Azam group, which merged together to become Al Qaeda in the 90s, and turn them against the United States. And even though they had been attacking us since 1990, and they again in 92, 93, 95, 96, 98, 2000, Bill Clinton was still backing them anyway in Bosnia, Kosovo, and in Chechnya, and turning a blind eye to the danger that they posed to the United States of America. But their primary motivation for turning on America was the permanent bases in Saudi Arabia being used to bomb and blockade Iraq. And by the way, even Paul Wolfowitz later said when he came to work for W. Bush that that's right, Scott. That's why we have to get the bases out of Saudi Arabia. So, what we're going to do is we're going to invade Iraq. That way, we can move the bases from Saudi to Iraq. So, we won't be motivating bin Ladenite terrorism against us anymore. Isn't that a great idea? And he said that himself. You can read it in the Vanity Fair article, the Vanity Fair interview with Sam Tenenhouse from 2003. This is one of the reasons that he launched Iraq War II was he said that, yeah, the bases in Saudi are causing blowback. So we'll have to start another massive war and just move our bases into Mesopotamia. That'll calm everything down.
I really appreciate you taking the time to explain that, to debunk that propaganda, because as we've all realized by now, the last 20, 25 years have just been Americans consuming and just having it shoved down our throat. All of this Israeli propaganda, basically a psyop, to convince us that Israel's enemies are our own. So I appreciate you explaining why all those wars that we fought were not for our own interests, were actually for Israel's. Um, in line with that, I want to ask you and redirect back to the Iran nuclear program, because there has been this propaganda campaign around that for many years, going back at least 30 years, to try to convince us that Iran's civilian nuclear program is actually a very dangerous weapon, and that it's a threat not just to Israel, but to us here in the United States. You have, or probably one of the only people who have, this kind of encyclopedic knowledge about that topic, not just the politics, but also some of the nuclear science policy around it. Can you perhaps take some time to explain how that propaganda campaign has evolved and why it makes no sense?
Yes, huge topic. So let's start with the fact that Iran has been a member of the Nonproliferation Treaty since 1968. And as part of their agreement under that treaty, they have a deal with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which has the authority then under their safeguards agreement to inspect any facilities where nuclear material is being introduced into any machines of any kind, used in any way, in order to, in their terminology, to verify the non diversion of this declared nuclear material to any military or other special purpose. And so that's the same deal that all non nuclear weapon states who join the NPT promised to do. So at the time they signed it, they didn't even really have a nuclear program at all. They began to try to start building nuclear reactors in the Shah's time in the 70s, but all that got put on the shelf after the revolution of 1979 until this century, the very beginning of this century. There may have been some experimentation, bench level stuff in the 90s, but they built their well, no, 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 that's not right. I need to go back. Um, you know what? I'm not certain exactly when Boucher and Iraq were built, but at least I think that would have been in the 1990s. And but the thing is, they had no source of their own fuel for the reactors until they built their Natanz enrichment facility in 2005 and 2006. They have their own domestic supplies of uranium, and they bought the equipment on the black market from the Pakistanis, from AQ Khan. In fact, Gordon Prather would point out in his articles for antiwar.com that the Iranians had tried to buy a light water reactor from China in the 1990s. And a light water reactor cannot produce weapons grade plutonium, or at least its waste is so polluted with other isotopes that it basically makes it impossible to um, process that plutonium waste into usable fuel for a weapon. And so, but Bill Clinton stopped China and interfered in that. Um, and so they ended up building heavy water reactors instead that can produce plutonium that can be reprocessed potentially into weapons fuel. So just a hint of the beginnings of the counterproductivity of American intervention on this question in the first place there. But then in 2006, they opened Natanz. And at Natanz, this is where you have those terrifying aluminum tubes actually in practice here. And what's happening is you take uh, the famous yellow cake uranium from the lies about Iraq War II, or the famous Dave Chappelle skit, Black Bush. Don't drop that. Um, so that yellow cake, that's partially refined uranium ore. And what you have to do is process that and convert it, as they call it, into uranium hexafluoride gas. And it's uranium hexafluoride gas that you introduce into the centrifuge cascades. And what happens is, in those aluminum tubes, those centrifuges, they spin that gas at super high speeds. And then that separates out the uranium isotopes 235 from the 238. And then it's what they call a cascade, because they have the gas go from one machine to the other, to the other, to the other. And as it goes down the cascade, it gets purer and purer uranium 235. That's the sweet stuff. Now, at 3.6%, you would use that enriched uranium for your electricity program. At 20%, you can use that. That's 20% uranium 235. You use that as targets for medical isotope reactors, for making radioactive dye for some, body exams, and also radiation for cancer treatment. Um, then there's, depending on what reactor you have, there's basically no use for mid range until you get up to closer to 90% or into the 90% uranium 235. Now you're talking weapons grade uranium. So we'll get back to the 60%, which again, I said was just a bargaining chip in the first place. There's no other real use for it. But so anyway, there's a, let's be mean about this, okay? Like, I don't give a damn about the Ayatollah. I know you don't either, okay? They got a loophole in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which says that they can pursue nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. But that includes mastering the fuel cycle and the ability to make weapons grade uranium, and the creation of facilities that you could make weapons grade uranium with. So there's a reason why proliferation hawks, when it comes to our enemies anyway, would be very concerned that you could drive a truck through that loophole in the NPT, that you can become a nuclear weapons threshold state within the rules, right? So this is what, from the point of view of the American hawks, particularly those inspired by the Likud, has to be absolutely unacceptable. That, America might have let the Russians and the Chinese get atom bombs, but we'll go to war with Iran before we let them get atom bombs. No way. And that's basically obviously a policy, made in Tel Aviv rather than Washington. But anyway, so again, insisting on no naivete here, you know what I mean? What the Ayatollah seems to have done, he never said it this way, but it's pretty apparent through the body language, right? That, like, what he was doing was creating a bluff, right? A latent nuclear deterrent, not an atom bomb that says, don't you attack me or I'll use my atom bombs, but the ability to create an atom bomb saying, don't you attack me or I'll make one. Then you better not attack me again or I'll use it, kind of a thing. This is essentially the same position that Brazil and Germany and Japan are in, although nobody's threatening them. But they all have the ability to break out. They're called nuclear threshold states with latent deterrence, basically. And that was seemingly what the Ayatollah was going for there. with their program. Now, from the Israeli point of view, for them to have an enrichment program at all, they don't give a damn what the NPT says. Loophole, nothing. We'll murder their scientists. We'll sabotage their enrichment facilities with malware. We'll do anything we can to prevent them from making progress on a nuclear program at all, and as well as pressure the United States of America. George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, all of them swore before Almighty God that they will start a war with Iran before they sit back and allow them to acquire a nuclear weapon, to go ahead and begin that process and complete that process. And so that's due to extraordinary lobbying by Israel, of course, again. So now, where that left us with, let's say, okay, so, through W. Bush into Obama, they're building this capability. Obama is in a situation where it was funny at the time, all through the Bush and Obama years, up until the very end, you might have thought that there was no nonproliferation treaty, that there was no safeguards agreement, that the world had no idea what was going on there. In fact, in the Bush years, they used to just claim constantly that the War Party would, in general, in government and outside it, but in Washington, in the media, that there's a parallel secret, illicit nuclear weapons program. What's going on at Natanz, that's just a facade. They're diverting that material, and there's a secret parallel nuclear weapons program. They would try to insist on that for times. They could never prove it because it didn't exist, but they would say that at least. Um, but a lot of the time, like, you would just never have in a news report, even in it, reading David Sanger in the New York Times, like, they would never say, now listen, just so you understand, they are in the NPT and they do have a safeguards agreement. And while the IAEA has complained about this and that, all those issues have really been were small technical issues and have all been resolved and explained away, and there ain't much there. And whatever. They don't ever really do that, like you could read it piecemeal. If you read everything Sanger wrote in the New York Times, you get the idea overall that, like, okay, they're actually not really making weapons here. They're staying within the threshold, but they're just, being difficult because America's being difficult. Like, as you introduce the topic, we're the intransigent ones. They're the ones who are just trying to survive in a world with us. Um, so then there was a real threat of war when Obama came in, or at least there was a very real bluff by Benjamin Netanyahu and his government then that American officials believed, man, we think Israel's going to start this war and drag us into it. And the idea was that it would be much worse then. And we still had troops in Iraq then as well, 100,000 of them or so, essentially hostages of the Shiite militias that the war had been fought to put in power there. And so they were really worried about the consequences of a war and that Israel might just go ahead. Famously, or at least, at the time, it was notable, and I think it's still notable now. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Rockefeller's man, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, the Henry Kissinger of the Democratic Party for 40 years before he died, right? He told Obama, if Israel tries to attack Iran and flies over Iraq, you should shoot their jets down over Iraq before you let them attack Iran. And which, was it was a very hot discussion at the time of whether this was really going to happen or not. So this was the real impetus for Obama to seek what became known as the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. And all that deal really did was, one, scale back Iran's nuclear program. So they poured concrete in their Iraq heavy water reactor. They um, they scaled back their centrifuge cascades at Natanz by, I think, 1/3. They turned the cascade facility at Fordo, or COM as it's called, or COM or Fordo as it's called more often now, I guess, into just a research facility rather than a production facility. And they expanded the inspections regime, including, and this amounted to really just signing what are called additional protocols to their safeguards agreement, allowing inspections even at non-nuclear facilities, as long as the IAEA or the powers behind them could demonstrate a reason why to search. So this is far above and beyond any safeguards agreement that any other country ever had with the IAEA to search even military bases. And the way it worked was, Unlike a usual UN Security Council vote where any major power can veto with a no, this deal was with the entire UN Security Council, but it was majority rules. And that means it's America, Britain, and France versus Russia and China. So America and their allies win every time. If it's a matter of fact, and the Americans really have a good case, or even if they only have a half ass one, they'll be able to get Britain and France to go along. And then majority rules. And at that point, if they vote and say, we get to inspect this military facility based on this cause, then Iran would have to give in or the sanctions would kick back in. That was the form of the deal. On our side, we're supposed to lift the sanctions. The UN and the United States are supposed to lift the sanctions on Iran. And yes, that included that pallet full of cash, which was so infamous. People took it like it was welfare for Somalis in Minnesota or whatever. But what it actually was their own money that Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski had stolen back in
Yeah.
1979 during the Iranian Revolution, which they had sent to the United States for arms purchases. And they kept the money and kept the weapons. And so now they're just giving them their own money back. I mean, I hate to give John Kerry credit for anything, but that was what he agreed. We'll lift some of the sanctions on you, which is not doing anything for you. It's just stopping doing something to you. And then we'll give you some of your own money back. And in exchange, you'll do all this and also forswear nuclear weapons forever, which they did. Now, the deal wasn't perfect. Donald Trump was right to complain that it had sunset provisions in it that, if you're an Obama bot, that's great. But what about the future, which keeps coming? And so, but the thing is, of course, that what Donald Trump did not do in his first term was come in and say, all right, Ayatollah, I don't like you and you don't like me, but my predecessor struck this deal with you and I want to improve upon it. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to follow through and lift some of these sanctions. I'm going to go ahead and open a consulate somewhere. I'm going to go ahead and try to be friendly. And let's reopen these negotiations and let's see if we can sweeten this deal and lift some of these sunsets. You don't want nuclear weapons anyway? Why do we need sunsets on what's going on at Fordo? Why do we need sunsets on, whatever enrichment levels? And also, I should have mentioned part of it was that any enrichment stockpile that they had would be transferred out of the country to France. And then I think they changed it to Russia. And then the Russians would take the enriched uranium, turn it into fuel rods, and ship it back. That way, you can't, it's much more difficult than to transform it back into gas and keep enriching it and all of that. So, sort of make the enrichment up to only 3.6% levels permanent once the Russians, and it keeps the stockpile of enriched uranium low, which is you could call their potential that they could turn into nuclear weapons fuel if they continued to and if they enriched it. You can't do that once it's out of the country or once it's already shipped back into fuel rods. At least you've added the time. You've added a lot of time to it there. So anyway, and then but Trump came in and instead of trying to sweeten the deal, he just tore it up at Netanyahu's insistence in 2018. And all that did was just put everybody in a worse position. It didn't really solve anything. And then when Biden came in, well, and he added, what they call the maximum pressure campaign, which was on top of Obama's crippling sanctions, which, by the way, they never really lifted all the sanctions that they promised to lift. They just promised to. That was their side of the deal. They never really did give them the sanctions relief, other than on a very minor level. Well, Trump just came in and put what they called maximum pressure, a full-scale Treasury Department war against Iran, far beyond what Bush or Obama had ever done. And then when Biden came in, did he say, well, everybody knows Donald Trump was a Russian plant and he only ruined our wonderful deal because of what a terrible, Tasmanian devil of a disruptor he was. And so now we're going to get right back in the deal. Joe Biden was the vice president under Barack Obama. Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan were instrumental in getting that deal through. Did he get back in the deal? No. He just kept Donald Trump's exact same maximum pressure campaign, again, of course, at the Israelis' behest, and kept that going through his entire term. And that's where Donald Trump then picked up here. And now, so what happened last June was he just went ahead and accepted Netanyahu's prescription, basically, that a nuclear program at all, or at least enrichment at all, is equivalent to them going ahead and enriching to weapons grade and making bombs out of it. And we're just going to not tolerate that. Again, as I said, even Netanyahu himself said they were a couple years away to Brett Baer a day after the war started. I think it was the second day of the war. He admitted that. So, in other words, they had not made any progress whatsoever because they weren't trying. Oh, and I should have mentioned, by the way, I skipped this in my narrative here, that in 2007, the National Intelligence Council came out with their famous national intelligence estimate that said that they quit even studying how to make a bomb after Bush got rid of Saddam Hussein for them. He was the only threat. They never thought they could deter the United States if we wanted to attack, but they thought they could use a nuke potentially to deter Saddam. But they gave it up then. That was according to Seymour Hersh's reporting about the thinking behind that NIE anyway. But Gareth Porter, in his great book, Manufactured Crisis, shows that the only thing that they had to base those conclusions on, the only things they had, was one, a group of DIA intercepts of dual use technology, things like special ring magnets and other things that could be used for scientific this and that, but also could be used in a nuclear program. And the DIA, in good faith, thought, hey, we think we're onto something here. This looks like this could be dual use technology surreptitiously being, compiled together for a potential illicit program here. But then they debunked that and they realized, no, we were wrong. And the IAEA went and found those magnets at the university, right where they claimed that they were going, right? And the stuff had not been diverted. And so it just turned out that was it. It was a good faith, suspicion, but it turned out not to be true. And then the only other thing that they based that conclusion on was the so-called smoking laptop, which we know was an Israeli forgery that they smuggled through the MEK communist terrorist cult. And the IAEA confirmed that that's where it came from. The CIA confirmed that they're the ones who came up with the laptop. So the whole story that this was an Iranian scientist laptop that was smuggled out of the country, they admitted was a lie. And then the whole thing was a lie. And even David Albright from so-called the good ISIS debunked the warhead nose cone story in the New York Times. Him and James Rice and him and David Sanger debunked that in the New York Times and said that what happened was whoever forged these documents were only going by the old nose cone. But the Iranians had just been completely redesigning the nose cone of their rocket so it wouldn't fit this delivery vehicle that the forgers had pretended, right? There's no reason to make a delivery vehicle for the wrong nose cone. And then also, there was the green salt experiment that showed that they were using lasers to make uranium tetrafluoride, which is, they call it green salt because it comes in these little granule things. But the deal is, though, that they already knew how to transform their ore all the way to uranium hexafluoride gas, which is what you need for the centrifuges. They had no need to screw around with this experiment with uranium tetrafluoride green salt stuff. They had already progressed past that stage by that time. And for other various reasons, that entire so-called smoking laptop, or the laptop of death, fell apart. It was an Israeli forgery. It wasn't true in the first place. Another crucial part here. Anyway, so then Israel starts the war last June. Donald Trump comes in and he did drop a bunch of bombs on Fordo and Natanz. And speaking of the so-called good ISIS and David Albright, I only read a preliminary report at their website maybe a week or so after the war. I should go back and look at their further studies of the damage that was done there. But it's, from the best I know, Fordo and Natanz have been essentially taken offline and are not producing, not enriching uranium whatsoever right now. And crucially, the conversion facility at Isfahan has been destroyed. That was always above ground, and they just hit it with Tomahawk missiles. And this is the facility that you need to turn the metal to gas and back to metal again. And so if they can't do that, it doesn't matter how much uranium hexafluoride gas they have if they can't turn it back into a metal. And it doesn't matter how much uranium metal they have if they can't turn it into a gas to enrich it. And so they're really, I think, severely set back. So then Donald Trump, you mentioned this ultimatum that says they can't have a nuclear program at all. Well, one of these, maybe 2 days ago, was you can't have a nuclear weapon. And the Iranians said, we'll agree to that. Because, of course, they've already agreed to that since 1968 and again in 2015 and over and over and over again. So, geez, if that's all you want to negotiate, sure. But, and I think there is, too. I accuse them. I said, let's be cynical and say, look, the only reason they want to have mastered the fuel cycle is for a potential nuclear weapons deterrent. And that might not be right. It could be, in fact, that no, they've just decided they have oil and uranium, but there's a lot larger market in the world for oil than there is uranium. So let's burn our uranium for our electricity and sell our oil. And you can't tell me no, because that's what it means to be a sovereign nation state. And so, if, the same as if any, imagine the entire United Nations telling America we're not allowed to enrich uranium anymore. Forget it, dude. It's not up to you. You don't get to tell us what to do. And so there is, I don't want to sound naive. I would rather take the more cynical view. And I have thought always that he meant the whole program to be a latent deterrent. But then again, after we called their bluff, maybe we just showed when Donald Trump called their bluff last June, it could be that he showed that in fact it really is just an empty bluff. That in fact the Ayatollah and all of his horses and men cannot put together a nuclear weapon fast enough to deter us from bombing them first. That was always the standoff. Now we're willing to our side has shown we're willing to go ahead and bomb before they cross the threshold, before they even try. So that skews the entire equation against the Ayatollah's, game theory this whole time. So, quite frankly, I don't know what he has to lose to give up enrichment at this point. You know what I mean? He could still get, other than face, he could still get fuel rods from the Russians if that's what he wants, you know? Um, and who knows? I really don't know. But I think face and sovereignty do count for a lot to leaders of sovereign governments, probably more than they should. And especially when, after all, Iran is just completely overmatched here, right? I mean, we do have assets in the Gulf at risk. I'm not saying that. But compared to what they have at risk for getting into a real war with the United States of America, you can imagine like their only real responsible course of action is to do everything they can to appease us, short of blowing their own brains out.
Yeah, and again, I appreciate that you take the time to give these kind of longer responses because it really only takes like a few seconds for Israel firsters to spread these lies in the first place, but it does actually take a good amount of time to debunk them and explain them, which is one of the reasons why like cable news sucks. There's just no time at all
Right.
on any of those places to do that. I want to ask you about something that you mentioned in your last answer, which is this sanctions regime that we've had in place against Iran for many, many years, at least 50 years, um, based around, yes, this nuclear program now, but also just the type of government that they have. The reasons for the sanctions keep changing, but ultimately we have them not just to cause economic devastation. There's supposed to be some sort of political outcome that we're hoping to get from them,
Yeah.
which, as was announced by the Department of Treasury by Secretary Bessent when he said we're going to make Iran broke again. He said that in March of 2025 at the Economics Club. The reason that we were going to do this and maintain this maximum pressure campaign was to curb their behavior in the region. So, for one, their nuclear program, but also their ballistic missiles, and again, their support for what are called their proxy groups in the region, like Hezbollah and the Houthis, which I urge everyone to kind of go and look into, and you'll discover that they're barely Iranian proxy groups. They're actually really independent. The Houthis and Hezbollah, they don't necessarily take orders from Tehran. Like the Houthis, for example, are fighting or have been fighting Saudi Arabia. They've been fighting Israel. They have independent grievances that are different than Tehran. So but I want to ask you about the sanctions regime because we've had it in place for 50 years and it seems like nothing has really changed. We haven't changed Iran's behavior. If anything, Israel firsters, like at the Foundation for Defensive Democracy, continue to argue that Iran is more aggressive than ever, that they just can't be contained despite these sanctions, which are supposed to curb their behavior. Are these sanctions working other than just being pointlessly brutal and cruel?
Well, it's interesting, right? I mean, we don't know exactly what would happen if we normalized relations with them and just tried to kill them with kindness and open trade instead. But you could see how that might disincentivize bad behavior if they have a lot to gain from getting along rather than just, you know, surviving threats and punishment the way that it's all structured now. I think the reality is America could have normalized relations with Iran back in the early 1990s, at least. People love to bring up the Beirut bombing of 1983, which wasn't Iran, but it was an Iranian backed group, sort of proto Hezbollah, that did that. But that was in 83, and Ronald Reagan sold the missiles in 84 and 85 and 86, man, through the Israelis, by the way, who were still friends with the Ayatollah at the time. So people want to bring up that kind of ancient history, as Jimmy Carter might say, as an excuse why we got to attack them now. It just goes to show that they don't have much. You'll also hear lies like they killed 600 Americans in Iraq War II, but that's not true. That's, as George W. Bush would say, oh, well, I shorthanded it, meaning, yeah, 1, 2, skip a few, 99, 100. And what he really meant to say, and all through there in the deleted yada yada part, is actually Iraqi Shiites made bombs in Iraq and used them against Americans. And in fact, it was the least Iran tied of the Shiite groups, the Muqtada al-Sadr Mahdi army that America was fighting at that time, on behalf of the most Iran tied groups, the Dawa Party and the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution and their Badr Brigade in the internal Shiite schism in Iraq in 2007. And it was really Petraeus who turned on Sadr first and picked that fight because they were trying to drum up an excuse to attack Iran then. And it all fell apart. And as I show in enough already, there got 10 or 15 sources where those bomb factories, those EFP bomb factories with the copper cores, were found in Iraq over and over and over again. And I've got sources that I quote from the highest level military intelligence and all that who swear that it's true. They never really found proof that those bombs were coming from Iran, despite all of that hype and propaganda campaign. And even if the bombs had been coming from Iran, they certainly didn't prove that it was the IRGC behind it. And even if they had proven that, that doesn't mean, oh, Iran killed 600 of our guys. It still means David Petraeus decided to attack Muqtada al-Sadr and get 600 Americans killed, fighting the guy they were fighting the whole war for. As you may know, Muqtada al-Sadr is one of the most important and powerful kingmakers in Iraqi Shiite society today because George W. Bush and David Petraeus put him there. So a bit of hypocrisy, behind that pile of lies. And then that's really all they got. They say, oh, Hezbollah is in Latin America, but Larry Larry Johnson, the former CIA officer, is like, listen, he told me this. He's like, listen, pal, I'm the world's greatest expert on this. Okay. And all they're doing is making money down there. This is not terrorism. This is just merchant, doing business down there rather than any real danger. They got to go back to this fake attack debunked by Gareth Porter, where Hezbollah supposedly attacked these Jews in Buenos Aires in 1994. But it was actually right wingers within the police force that did it, not Hezbollah. The Israelis love lying about their Shiite enemies whenever they can, is all that was there. And so I'm sorry. And then here's the thing about the sanctions. There's a parallel here, okay? H.W. Bush and Robert Gates, who worked for him at the time as deputy director of the CIA, or I guess head of the CIA at the time, they said, we'll never lift the sanctions against Iraq until Saddam Hussein is gone. When Bill Clinton came in, as I said, he hemmed and hawed for the first few months there, but after the fake assassination attempt, him and his government, his first Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, and then Madeleine Albright, repeated over and over again that the sanctions will stay until Saddam Hussein goes. And what that meant was essentially we're going to starve the people of Iraq and make their lives so miserable that they will risk everything to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein and his government. Even though they had their chance in 1991 after the first Iraq War, when George Bush Sr. encouraged the Shiites and the Kurds to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. But then he stabbed them in the back and let Saddam Hussein keep his helicopters and tanks and crush their uprising and kill 100,000 people. That then became part of the excuse to stay in Saudi Arabia, to enforce that no-fly zone, as though he was just going to kill every last Shiite when the insurrection was over. And then that was, again, part of the reason why they had to stay. But of course, the point being that we're collectively punishing the civilian population of the country who we know are in no position whatsoever to overthrow Saddam, in the name of making them so desperate that they'll somehow do it with magic or something, which they ended up, this was part of the crisis of the Iraq war, was we can't just lift the sanctions regime, but we can't just keep it forever, so I guess we'll have to invade and do a regime change, was part of the thinking even at that time. um, but now here's the thing. I would like to be able to tell you that the lesson from that is sanctions don't work at regime change. You can make people miserable, but you're only going to make the regime more wealthy at their expense. And we can see this in the case of Iran to a great degree, where the more that you outlaw the open market and the more the black market takes over, the more the IRGC are the ones who run the black market because they control the state. They're the most powerful guys. And so they end up gangsterizing control over oil and whatever like that. But then, real quick here, is we have a very terrible counterexample in favor of the war party's argument, which is sanctions did help to kill the Ba'athist regime in Syria. And that country was so bankrupted by American sanctions and, control over their oil and wheat and revenue, and drove that country, the nation itself, the government itself, into such bankruptcy that only the very most powerful people were able to have anything, and they were only able to have it by stealing and by depriving others of it in the worst sort of hoarding and rationing that a desperate regime can engage in. And so when the Al Qaeda did their own October the 7th and broke out of the Idlib province to take over the capital cities at the end of 2014. The army just melted away because their bellies were empty, right? There was nothing for them to fight for, and they had been truly bankrupted out of existence. And Al Qaeda just ended up walking right in and taking over that country. So the danger there then is a bunch of goons at the U.S. Treasury Department are going, see, we're so good at this. We can target these sanctions. We can cripple this guy and cripple this guy. Look at how they took their approach to Russia. They said, we're going to use an economic nuclear bomb against Russia. We're going to steal all their money. We're going to bankrupt them. The ruble will be rubble and will drive their economy into total bankruptcy. And I think that still may be the plan, not that it's working very well. But to inflict on Russia this strategic defeat. If you're going to take it, Eastern Ukraine, we're at least going to make it cost you a lot to do so.
Well, that worked in the short term, but confiscating all those Russian assets had the effect of discouraging other countries from keeping reserves in the United States, because we could just do that to them if they get on our shit list in the future. I want to ask you one final question, which is that a lot of people thought that this past weekend on Saturday we would bomb. There were some reports, I think from Dropsite News, there was a source who had said that. It was very similar, or at least it reminded me of a few weeks ago when Tucker Carlson was on Judge Napolitano's show, and he was told by sources close to the White House that we would be bombing Venezuela. And we didn't actually end up bombing that weekend, but a couple weeks later we did, and we kidnapped Maduro extrajudicially and brought him back to New York to stand trial for, I guess, like owning machine guns or something like that. So it seems like there's a very real possibility that that can happen again, or some sort of operation like it. There are going to be talks this Friday in Turkey between the United States and Iran. What do you think we should expect from that? Should we see some sort of negotiations, or do you think that Trump could possibly do something like he did with Maduro?
Well, I'm afraid that just like with the Syria lesson there, that the Venezuela lesson is, see, we can do whatever we want. I guess George Bush and Barack Obama just suck at it. If you just get the right guy in there to pull the right trigger, then everything will go perfect. And you got to admit that, like, no, well, slight woundings, but no deaths on the American side. They were able to do an Afghan style night raid against the head of state and his wife in Venezuela and fly right out of there, jam all their radars and missiles and whatever, and have their way at that level. You got to figure in the White House, those guys were, that was like the biggest bump of cocaine of their lives, right?
Yeah.
Donald Trump, I'm sure, is still extremely high on the ease and great victory of his success there. And like, wow, these Delta boys, I tell them to do something and they do it. I wonder what we could do in Venezuela, what we might be able to do in Cuba. You know what? Get the president of Colombia on the phone. Tell him I'm calling to threaten him. And like, so, and you saw him talking, right? They're in the Wall Street Journal going, yeah, they're looking at Cuba now. Boy, that was easy. Maybe we will. Now, the Ayatollah in Tehran, I mean, I don't know what the combat applications group is telling uh, Trump about that. Um, hopefully, no. But you could see the same difference would be just drop a bomb on his head, kill the Ayatollah, kill the ruling council, and then tell the new guys, look, just don't appoint a new Ayatollah or I'm going to kill him too. You know what I mean? And like, I don't know, try to parachute the monarch in there, see what happens. I could see them trying it, man, just because, again, that attitude that came like, with Iraq after Panama was so easy that we got right into Iraq War One. And I think, W. Bush was maybe probably still a little bit enthused on that. And also Kosovo, which seemed to be easy since we just bombed from, high in the sky and they ended up dropping Annex B. That was why that war ended, by the way. It was America that surrendered, not Serbia. But W. Bush didn't know that. Seemed easy. And we didn't lose very many guys or anything like that. I think maybe we didn't lose any. Like a couple planes got shot down, but the guys bailed out. So, that was kind of the attitude going into Iraq in 2003 was we got the big green machine, man. There's nobody that can resist the force of American military power. So we just do whatever we want. No one can stop us. And again, just like, we're talking about with the economic war against Russia. Yeah, that's true, right? The US Treasury Department is the most powerful force in the solar system other than the DoD maybe, right? But doesn't mean that you can control all the consequences. It doesn't mean you can control everything. It just means you can destroy things, right? You can destroy a bank, you can destroy a mosque, you can destroy a village. But can you build something? Can you create the new circumstances that are going to be beneficial in the future? Probably not, right? And the idea of them accomplishing a successful regime change in Iran from the air, I mean, just seems completely absurd. I think the only real question is how hard would they fight back? Right? For all the talk about how crazy the all Muslims and maybe especially the Shiites are and how they all just want to die in an apocalypse as long as they can kill Israelis or whatever kind of thing. This Ayatollah has proven to be, at the very least, just patient, right? He's in a situation where he is so overmatched by the power of the United States of America, as I've put it for years now. I'm sorry, I need to think of a new way to say this, but like if you're the Ayatollah Khamenei, what are you going to do with a problem like the United States of America? You know, and try to appease us. That's all he can do. And and then even if it came to war, like you saw how ready he was to get off just a couple symbolic strikes after the murder of Soleimani, the assassination of Soleimani in the last Trump presidency. And even here, Trump dropped 14 bombs on Fordo and Natanz. So then the Ayatollah fired 14 missiles at our base in Qatar and missed, and warned, hey, they're coming, so shoot them down. But just clearly did not want to escalate the war because one, he knows he's dealing with the United States and ultimately our H bomb arsenal. And for that matter, with Donald Trump, who's a bit of a loose cannon, right? Like all other things being equal, I think Donald Trump is more likely to use nuclear weapons than Barack Obama, for example, if he got upset. You know what I mean? Like if you're the Ayatollah and you got a shot at an American aircraft carrier, maybe you shouldn't take it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And and I think I don't know. It's easy to warn that if the regime is threatened, what we expect a regime to do, they're going to launch everything they've got. That should probably be the default. And then so we should just hope and pray that actually they would rather die than the regime itself would rather die than get their whole country killed along with them, which they know is a possibility if it comes down to it. And so that's the position that they've been put in. So I would expect them to be as reasonable as they can in these talks. And I don't know whether Trump is trying to build in an escape hatch for them and a basis for reasonable accommodation, or if he truly does mean to just give them an offer they can't possibly accept. Um, you know, I guess my money'd be on that, but I really don't know. See, I'll add one thing to that though. And this goes to my post Venezuela hubris rant there a minute ago. In his lengthy interview with the New York Times, like he sat with them for 2 hours in the Oval Office or something 2 weeks ago. And he went on for a bit about Operation Eagle Claw. in the desert in Iran when Jimmy Carter tried to go rescue the hostages, sent the special operations teams to try to rescue the hostages, and it ended up in a terrible debacle in the desert. A helicopter crashed into a plane, and some guys were killed, and it was a total humiliation. It probably cost Carter, 5 points or more in the election. I mean, it was really part of his humiliation and part of his defeat by Ronald Reagan months later. And Trump went on and on about that, about how, boy, when I sent the Delta Force guys in to get Maduro, I was really risking an Operation Eagle Claw type disaster. That could have really gone wrong, and I would have looked really bad. And so, boy, oh boy, I sure am grateful that it went off without a hitch the way it did. Or whatever. So it goes to show that he does have rightfully some fear about consequences, right? Like maybe people will put up with the kidnapping of a head of state. Nobody loves Maduro. Even Greg Palast is like Maduro is scum. You know what I mean? Fine. But a war, like a starting the war in a purely George W. Bushian, unprovoked, aggressive fashion, a war of regime change, a war that leads to unlimited and untold and unpredictable commitments down the road and all of this, I mean, he'd be just absolutely out of his mind to do it. And that's, the best argument against it, right? He's got no real reason to do it. He's got a hell of a lot of major reasons why not to risk it. And so, I hope he's got somebody speaking some wisdom to him up there. I mean, you know, you would think that JD Vance would be one of the more reasonable ones, but at least according to his people talking to the newspapers, he's out front saying, yeah, you should hit regime targets. So it ain't just Rubio. It's the guy that you would, think might write for TAC or might have once or something, but no.
Scott, I really appreciate you taking the time to be here to talk with me today. Hopefully, we will not be going to war with Iran anytime soon, but it looks like it's possible.
Thank you very much for having me. It's good to be with you.
And I should say, if people want to find your stuff, I know that you run the Scott Horton Academy now. Could you just tell people a little bit about it and how they can subscribe to it?
Yeah, well, the purpose of the Scott Horton Academy basically was to, as Tom Woods put it, Scott Horton slowed down so that you can catch up. And so I've been doing this for a long, long time. I've been working with antiwar.com basically since the turn of the century. I've done 6,000 interviews with all these experts and stuff. And so I've learned all this stuff. And so now I've kind of put it together where hopefully it's a good sort of 101 course in American foreign policy on the Middle East, as well as the Cold War with Russia and Eastern Europe and the war in Ukraine. To try to be available to essentially train up a new generation of anti-war people, give everybody a solid foundation to stand on, to multiply our argument out there in the world. I got to tell you, man, 20 years ago was just nothing but neocon echo chamber everywhere. And I think, we don't have the money and the power, but we are absolutely dominating the discussion right now. And so the purpose of the academy is just to say, look, if you want in on this non-interventionist foreign policy fight, here's where you get caught up on what all's going on, how it got to be this way, and all the best arguments against this policy going forward and the rest. And so it features courses by myself, James Bovard, Ramsey Baroud, Bill Bupert, and even we have one by a guy named Adam Francisco, a professor from Concordia University, debunking Christian Zionism. And so all kinds of great stuff. And I'll tell you what, um, if anybody goes to scotthortonacademy.com and use promo code TAC, we'll give you 10% off.
Oh, awesome. I mean, I highly recommend it. It's very important what you're doing because I could just say, growing up, we had all these Israeli operations, basically, which were Prager University or the Daily Wire, who would produce this kind of content, which was a lot of revisionist history. All the Muslims are evil. You have to worship Israel. They're our greatest ally in the Middle East, and support this war and that war. So it's great that you're putting all this stuff in one place for people to consume it. Obviously, Gen Z is incredibly interested in this stuff. They've been radicalized by this Gaza genocide that we've all just had to pay for whatever reason. And they've all seen the live stream videos of children being murdered on a daily basis, financed by U.S. tax dollars.
Yeah.
And so people want this. So I'm glad that it's out there, and I hope that people subscribe to it.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, man. Appreciate that.